I am California of the past.
I am
California
California of the past.
I
I am
am
California of the
past.
past.
Hello, my name is Pat Morris, Mayor of the City of San Bernardino, and I'm here to tell a story, or two, or three, about this city, its history, and in part my history. We'll begin with a story about my history. It relates in some tangential way to the history of this city, because I was born into a family of people that were all in some way tied to the Santa Fe Railroad. I grew up in a town called Needles, way out in the Mojave Desert, along a river called the Colorado. And the largest employer in that community, indeed the only great employer in that community, was Santa Fe Railroad. That was a division point for this great east to west railway. My grandfather was a section superintendent who oversaw all the section crews that repaired the tracks from Los Angeles to Flagstaff. I visited my grandfather at various section housing along that route in my early childhood. My father was a conductor for Santa Fe, and his run was from Needles to Barstow and Needles to Seligman, Arizona, west and east. I had an uncle who was also a conductor for Santa Fe. My whole family was in some ways tied to the railroad, and that's the way we earned our living. I grew up in Needles, in a town that was dependent upon the railroad for its economic prosperity. The town was not only a division point, it had a roundhouse. It had some 24 tracks for assembling and disassembling trains. It had the largest ice plant on the entire Santa Fe system. Before the advent of refrigeration, the way that we cooled the cars that left the San Joaquin, the Imperial, and the Coachella Valley headed for Chicago was in what they call reefer cars. At the end of each of those cars, filled with fruit and vegetables, was a locker in which ice was placed, chopped up ice that was blown across the product all the way from Imperial Valley, from Blythe, Bakersfield, Arvin, Colton, all the way to Chicago. Along that route were placed ice plants. Whereas the ice melted, the train would pull alongside a great dock, and hundreds of workers would then chop up 300-pound blocks of ice and put them in these reefer cars to cool the product. They were pre-iced in Blythe and in Bakersfield and in Colton, and then the longest and the hottest run was from this city, from San Bernardino to Needles, 250 miles of the Great Mojave Desert. And all these products were shipped, of course, during the summertime, during the growing season, and that desert was hot as Hades. So, by the time we got to Needles, those reefer cars had melted ice. The Needles Ice Plant, therefore, was the biggest plant on the entire system. They had a 12-story tall winter storage, a manufacturing capacity that was gargantuan. I began my young life as an engineer's helper, since my father grew up as an iceman, as a young man in Los Angeles and San Diego. He knew the trade, and I got a job helping the engineers at the ice plant manufacture ice. At the age of 18, I got a job as an ice handler, basically handling those 300-pound blocks of ice, putting them on the chain to go up onto the dock, and then going up on the dock with the Navajo and Mojave Indians to ice the trains down. Backbreaking work. For those cars that needed the greatest refrigeration, we would then salt the ice with great 100-pound bags of salt over the ice, that, as you do with an ice maker, to make ice cream. It made the air cooler for the most gentle or fragile of the produce that was headed east. As a young man, that was what I did. Through junior high school and high school, I worked in that backbreaking work. All the kids in Needles went to work for Santa Fe. Very few went to college, actually, because there was a good union scale wage job waiting for them somewhere in the Santa Fe system, at the roundhouse, in the yards, as a switchman, as a brakeman, as a fireman, as an engineer. So most all the kids in my high school class did not intend to go on to college, but stay home and get a good job on the railroad. My father and mother had different ideas for my brother, myself, and my sister, and therefore my father put me to work in the hardest possible job, and my brother as well, at the ice plant, to teach us what hard work was like, back-breaking work, next to some hard-working Native Americans who worked beside us all those years. And both my brother and I wanted to go to work in the railroad. That's what you did in Needles, and my father and mother wouldn't allow it. They wanted to teach us hard labor, and that the only way out of hard labor was education. So until I was a sophomore in college, and my father and mother were assured that I was going to complete college, we worked at the ice plant. And then when my father said, "I think you boys," my brother worked as a day laborer in the ice plant with me. By the time we were both in college, well ensconced at the University of Redlands, he said, "We've got good grades, I think you'll complete this experience. You can actually make some money now," and allowed us to sign up, my brother as a fireman and I was as a brakeman. So for the last 2 years of college and 3 years of law school at Stanford, I worked as a brakeman for Santa Fe. The same run my father had between Needles and Barstow and Needles and Seligman, west to east. And because it was the longest division in the Santa Fe Railroad, and you were paid by the mile as a brakeman or a conductor or a fireman or an engineer, it was a remarkably wonderful job. It paid the University of Redlands tuition. It paid the Stanford Law School tuition. And a lot of my friends in college and law school had jobs that were a lot less valuable than the job I had. In fact, when I was in law school, a lot of my friends went to work for law firms in the summertime and earned modest wages. I went back to Needles at every vacation period. Every summer I was home working on the railroad. I would go home on Thanksgiving and get on the extra board and make a few bucks. Christmas the same way, Easter the same way. They allowed us out there as young men to sign up when the regular crews took off on holidays. The young guys home from college worked. And that's the way I earned my living. A lot of my runs were actually here through San Bernardino. I recall vividly my stops as a young man on the railroad. You worked both passenger and freight. Typically it was freight work where you went to work in Levi's or overalls. But when you went passenger, when you were called out for the El Capitan, the super chief, or the Grand Canyon Limited, you had to wear a passenger uniform, be dressed up with shirt and tie. And those passenger runs were from Needles to LA Union and Needles all the way to Flagstaff. So I passed through this town many, many times as a young brakeman in passenger service. And when I was in college and I was still working for the railroad, I would take the train home from our station here. I would come over with a friend's car from the University of Redlands and then hop on the train in our city and head home for all my holidays. So I was well familiar with our historic depot. But that's the story of our family. My father was, for 25 years, a conductor for Santa Fe. He was also involved civically in local politics. He was the mayor of the city for many years and a city councilman, which provoked my interest in civic affairs, in public service, and policy making. So that was my baptism, actually. Watching my father do his work as a city council person and as mayor of the city provoked my interest in this whole thing called elected office.